Imagine if, to learn a new skill, the actual physical wiring of your brain had to completely uproot itself. Like it literally had to migrate across your skull.
Right, which sounds, I mean, it sounds like some bizarre piece of science fiction, honestly.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Because we usually picture the human brain as this static biological computer, right? Like a fixed piece of hardware with these permanent, neatly labeled circuits.
Yeah, you've got the vision center over here, the language center over there, and they just, well, they stay put.
Right, they stay put. But there's this monumental shift happening right now in how we understand the mind. I mean, what if your brain's networks are actually packing up and moving, like constantly rezoning themselves from the day you were born until the day you die?
It completely upends that whole biological computer analogy. I mean, if we want to truly understand human cognition, how we develop, how we age, looking at the physical anatomy, just, it isn't enough anymore.
Right.
We really have to map the brain's functional space. We need to understand a landscape that is, well, constantly shifting its own coordinates.
And that shifting landscape, that's exactly our mission for this deep dive. We are looking at a really groundbreaking 2026 paper. It was published in the journal Nature by Taylor and colleagues.
Yeah, functional hierarchy of the human neocortex across the lifespan.
Right, exactly. And for the very first time, researchers have built this continuous, unbroken map of how the human brain's functional networks organize and, well, reorganize themselves, starting all the way from birth and going up to like 100 years of age.
It's massive, a really sweeping look at the human lifespan.
It is. And we're going to explore exactly how the software of your mind, literally the software, physically outgrows the brain you were born with. It's fascinating.
It really is. But to start making sense of this century-long timeline, we first have to understand the map the researchers are actually using.
Right.
Because they aren't looking at the physical folds of the brain tissue. They're measuring something called functional connectivity gradients.
Okay, let's unpack this immediately because functional connectivity gradients sounds incredibly dense. I mean, if we aren't looking at the physical tissue, what are we actually mapping here?
We're mapping communication, essentially. Functional connectivity is measured by looking at how different regions of the brain synchronize their activity in real time.
So like timing.
Yeah. So if two completely different physical areas of the brain are lighting up, using blood flow at the exact same millisecond, they're functionally connected. They are talking to each other.
Oh, wow. Okay, so that's the functional connectivity part. What about the gradients?
Right, so a gradient is just a way of mapping that communication along a smooth, continuous spectrum. Instead of putting brain functions into these rigid, isolated boxes, we plot them along a flowing continuum.
Okay, I think I get it. So instead of a corporate ladder with, rigid floor plans, which always felt a bit too stiff for biology anyway, maybe a better way to visualize this is like a sprawling, developing city.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah. So the gradients are like the continuous zoning spectrums of that city, right?
Yeah.
From the noisy industrial districts all the way up to the quiet, abstract think tanks out in the hills.
That captures the fluidity perfectly, actually. And just like a major metropolis, the brain's zoning isn't plotted on just one flat line. The study identifies 3 dominant axes that make up the brain's fundamental coordinate system.
3 axes, okay.
Yeah, the first one, and by far the most prominent, is the SA axis. That stands for sensory association.
Okay, so if I'm applying the city metaphor here, the sensory end of that spectrum has to be the industrial zone, right? Like the raw material intake.
Yeah.
What we literally see, hear, and touch in real time.
Exactly. That's the anchor on one side. And then on the complete opposite end of the SA axis is the association pole.
The think tanks.
Right. The think tanks. This area is dominated by the default mode network. So this is the area of the brain responsible for high-level abstract thought, introspection, daydreaming, imagining the future.
Oh, interesting.
So this first axis, it's this massive spectrum mapping just how far our abstract thoughts are pulled away from our immediate, raw physical sensations.
Which leaves the second and third axis to flesh out the map then.
Yeah. So the second is the VS axis, or visual somatosensory, and this one is a much simpler spectrum. It just differentiates between the different types of raw intake.
Like separating what we see from what we feel.
Precisely. It separates the visual cortex from the sensoromotor cortex, so processing what we physically feel and how we move.
Got it. Visual versus touch. And then the third one.
Then we get to the third dominant spectrum, the MR axis, and that stands for modulation representation.
Modulation representation. Okay, so if representation is about representing the world like just taking it all in, what does the modulation part do?
Modulation is your top-down executive control. It's the traffic cops and the city planners, right?
Oh.
The modulation pole houses the networks that direct our attention, filter out distractions, force us to focus on a difficult task, while the representation pole on the other end is a broader category containing both those basic sensory systems and the daydreaming default mode.
I see. So it's the spectrum of highly focused control versus open, sort of wandering processing.
Exactly.
So if we pull all this together, just to recap real quick, we all have this three-dimensional coordinate system running our minds right now. The SA axis separates our raw senses from our deepest abstract thoughts. The VS axis separates our vision from our touch. And the MR axis separates our strict executive focus from our open, wandering minds.
That's a perfect summary.
Which makes me wonder where you, the listener, are currently plotting on this map right now.
Yeah.
I mean, if you're deeply focused on following the science with us, your modulation axis is probably working in overdrive to keep you anchored, right?
Definitely. But the truly revolutionary part of Taylor's research isn't just defining these three axes.
Right, because we kind of knew about these networks.
We did. The breakthrough is the discovery that this coordinate system is entirely unstable across a human lifespan. The city is constantly rezoning itself.
Right. The map itself morphs. So let's trace this timeline starting at 0. What does this internal city look like in a newborn baby?
It is remarkably concentrated. I mean, in the first 4 years of life, the brain undergoes its most explosive topographic reorganization.
Wow, first 4 years.
Yeah. At birth, the functional gradients are heavily anchored by those primary sensory systems. The SA and MR axes, the ones dealing with high-level association and executive control, they are fundamentally immature. The researchers actually referred to the infant state as a proto-SA architecture.
Proto-SA, meaning the city is basically 100% industrial zone at birth.
Exactly.
A newborn's entire functional world is just raw local sensory input. There are no quiet think tanks in the hills yet because they literally haven't been built.
Which perfectly aligns with developmental psychology, if you think about it.
Oh, for sure.
A newborn doesn't have a concept of the future or complex executive control. They exist in a state of immediate physical sensation.
Right.
But as the child grows into a toddler, these axes begin to aggressively differentiate. The higher order association and control regions literally begin to pull away from the sensory regions in the functional space.
And here is where the data gets really interesting, because the researchers track this metric called dispersion, right?
Yes. Dispersion.
And dispersion essentially measures how differentiated or how stretched out the brain's functional networks become. And you might assume this peaks when we are fully formed adults in our 30s or something, but it doesn't.
It really doesn't. Global dispersion hits its absolute peak around 13.8 years of age.
13.8.
Yeah. And the individual axis keeps stretching a bit more. So the SA axis reaches its maximum range at 18.8 years and the MR axis at 19.0 years.
Wow. We're literally seeing the biological signature of adolescence there.
We really are. It's a protracted maturation process. The functional distance between the primary sensory areas and those high-level abstract modulatory areas, it's expanding throughout childhood. But it stretches to its absolute maximum tension during the teenage years and early adulthood.
So wait, the teenage brain is essentially stretching its executive control networks to the absolute furthest mathematical distance from its raw sensory and emotional networks.
That's what the data shows.
How does that practically affect a teenager's behavior? Because, I mean, anyone who has ever interacted with a 15-year-old knows that their impulse control feels like it's operating in a completely different zip code.
Yeah, well, it offers a very sympathetic biological context for that behavior, I think. The adolescent brain is characterized by this maximal functional differentiation. The contrast between top-down modulatory systems and basic representation systems is at its peak.
It's pulled as tight as it goes.
Exactly. And evolutionarily, this is a necessary phase to establish complex, independent adult cognition. The brain needs to violently push these networks apart to define their distinct roles.
Even if that extreme stretching manifests as, erratic decision-making or emotional volatility in the short term.
Right. The architecture is literally under maximum tension.
Okay, so just to synthesize this timeline so far. We start life as little sensory sponges, entirely tethered to the physical moment. By age 4, we undergo massive internal rezoning. And then, as teenagers, our brains stretch our functional networks to their absolute limits, maximizing the distance between raw sensation and complex control.
That's the trajectory, yeah.
So think about a teenager in your own life right now, knowing their modulation axis is literally undergoing peak mathematical stretching. I mean, it definitely changes how you might view their occasional lack of judgment, doesn't it?
It certainly asks for a bit more patience from the adults in the room, I'd say.
Definitely.
But the stretching of the axis is really only half the story here. To understand how we actually learn and adapt, we have to look at what happens to the specific brain networks residing within that shifting coordinate space.
Right, because the boundaries of the city are expanding. But the actual neighborhoods, like the distinct functional networks themselves, are physically migrating within that space.
Exactly. And in the study, they use something called the Schaefer-7 network parcellation to track this.
Okay, what is the Schaefer parcellation?
It's simply a well-established model that groups the brain's cortex into 7 canonical networks. So things like the visual network, the somatomotor network, the control network, and so on.
Okay, so 7 main neighborhoods.
Right. And what this Nature paper reveals is that these 7 networks are completely nomadic. They migrate along the gradient axis as we mature.
But how does a network physically migrate? I mean, the neurons themselves aren't growing little legs and walking across the brain tissue, right?
No, the physical cells stay largely in place. The migration is a shift in synchronization. It's driven by mechanisms like synaptic pruning and Hebbian learning.
The old adage that cells that fire together wire together.
Exactly. Over years of development, millions of temporary synapses are pruned away, while other long-distance connections are strengthened through repeated use.
Oh, I see.
Because functional connectivity maps who is talking to whom. As these communication lines shift, the network's address in our functional city literally changes.
Okay, so who is moving where? Let's track these migrations.
Well, the most dramatic migrations happen with the default mode network and the control network. From birth all the way through mid-adolescence, these high-level networks continuously push outward toward the extreme far ends of the SA and MR axes.
Right, so using our city metaphor again, as the city expands, the high-level strategists and executives keep moving their headquarters to the absolute furthest outskirts to get away from the noise of the sensory-industrial zone.
Exactly. They are claiming the newly built suburbs.
To get that deep, uninterrupted processing.
Yes. But fascinatingly, not all networks move outward. Yeah. The somatomotor network, which is the system responsible for your voluntary physical movement, it starts out at an extreme sensory pull when we are born. But by around age 3, it reverses course.
It reverses.
Yeah, drifts inward, moving toward a much more central position on the SA axis.
Wow. Which honestly makes profound sense if you think about a developing child. I mean, a newborn's movements are just raw, chaotic reflexes, right? They just flail.
Right.
But by age 3, a toddler is learning to intentionally walk, grab objects, interact with the world. And to do that, the motor network can't just rely on raw sensation anymore. It has to move closer to the middle of the city to communicate with the planning and control networks. It has to integrate.
Exactly. The functional roles are dynamically repositioning to optimize for whatever developmental challenge the individual is currently facing.
It's incredible. So if you're tracking with us right now, brain networks are not permanent fixtures. Their functional roles actively migrate through pruning and shifting synchronization. Higher-order networks push to the quiet edges, and movement networks settle into the integrated center.
It's a very elegant system.
It really is. And it makes you wonder, if your brain's networks are constantly updating their resumes and addresses, what new skill are you currently rewiring your own network for today?
Well, that constant self-optimization is the hallmark of human neuroplasticity.
Right.
However, this functional migration forces us to confront a major biological puzzle. Everything we've discussed so far is just the software, the functional synchronization.
Okay.
How does all this shifting software relate to the brain's actual physical hardware and its genetic blueprint?
Right. Does the physical brain dictate what the software can do, or does the software run the show?
Well, the researchers examined this through a concept called structure-function coupling.
Structure-function coupling. Let's break that down.
They measured the physical microstructural elements of the brain, so specifically things like cortical thickness and myelination.
Myelination being the fatty insulation wrapping around nerve fibers to speed up electrical signals, right?
Precisely. It's the actual physical cables of the brain. And they found that in infancy and early childhood, the functional gradients and the physical gradients are tightly coupled. The physical hardware almost entirely dictates the functional software.
Okay, so the hardware's in charge early on.
Yes. But as we age, a massive decoupling occurs. The functional hierarchy essentially outgrows its physical microstructural scaffold.
Wait, it outgrows it.
Yeah.
And the paper found the same thing happens with our DNA too, right? They track something called transcriptomic signature. Which sounds complex, so let's pause. What exactly is a transcriptomic signature in this context?
A transcriptomic signature is essentially a map of gene expression. It shows us where specific genes in the brain are actively turned on and building proteins versus where they are dormant.
Okay.
The researchers cross-referenced their functional map with these genetic maps, and they discovered that genes responsible for synaptic signaling, basically the genes building the connections between neurons, they strongly scaffold the SA axis.
The sensory to abstract thought axis.
Right. And then genes responsible for ionic homeostasis scaffold the MR axis.
Wait, ionic homeostasis. Do we just jump into chemistry?
We did, a little bit. Ionic homeostasis is the process of balancing the electrical charge inside and outside of the brain's cells using ions like calcium and potassium.
Oh, right, because neurons fire electrically.
Exactly. It dictates how easily a neuron can fire an electrical pulse. So the genes regulating how excitable a neuron is are initially setting up the map for our executive control axis.
But just like the physical cables, this genetic scaffolding doesn't last, does it?
It does not. The genetic scaffold is transient. It's incredibly strong early in life, but it fades as we mature.
Okay, I want to make sure we don't breeze past the implications of this because it feels massive. Are you saying that our functional mind, like our active consciousness and complex thought processes, literally untethers from its physical and genetic blueprint as we get older?
The data strongly suggests exactly that. In infancy, your functional brain is highly tethered to the coarse physical and genetic variation you inherited. It's bound by local tissue properties. But as you experience the world, trillions of connections form.
The software takes over.
Right. The sheer volume of network traffic creates its own self-sustaining loops. Distributed functional coactivation takes over. The complex, synchronized firing of networks across vast distances becomes the primary driver of brain organization, totally bypassing the local genetic constraints.
The software writes its own rules. Okay, to recap this vital point for you listening, in your earliest years, your brain's function is strictly tethered to its physical thickness and its genetic code. But as you grow, your mind actively decouples from that structure.
It transcends it.
Exactly. Your thoughts and experiences literally transcend the initial biological scaffolding you were born with, which is just, does knowing that your mind eventually outgrows its original genetic blueprint make you feel a bit more in control of your own cognitive destiny? Because it certainly makes me feel less trapped by my DNA.
It implies a deeply profound level of lifelong functional plasticity. We are not just our genes.
I love that.
Which naturally leads us to the final critical question of the study. How does this untethering and the shifting of these spatial gradients actually impact our day-to-day intelligence? What happens to this beautifully complex system as we enter old age?
Right. What is the real-world cognitive payoff for having a perfectly mapped brain?
Well, to measure the payoff, the researchers utilized the NIH Toolbox Cognition Battery.
Testing subjects across multiple forms of intelligence, right?
Yes, and the results in young adulthood were remarkably clear. They looked at a metric called cosine similarity.
Okay, let me guess. Cosine similarity is a mathematical way of asking, how perfectly does this person's brain match the textbook ideal of a brain?
That is a very accurate translation, actually. It measures how faithful an individual's personal SA axis is to the canonical ideal template.
Okay.
And in young adults, having a highly faithful, perfectly stretched SA axis was a massive predictor of high cognitive performance, and it was domain general.
Meaning, it didn't just predict one specific skill. It predicted overall brain power, so fluid intelligence, reading comprehension, sustained attention.
Exactly. If your city is perfectly zoned, your brain operates at peak performance. A clearly expressed hierarchy, smoothly flowing from sensory input all the way to abstract thought, is the absolute hallmark of a cognitively high-performing young adult brain.
But the city doesn't stay perfectly zoned forever.
Yeah.
We talked about how the teenage brain stretches to the absolute maximum. What happens as we hit our 60s, 70s, and beyond?
Well, the aging trajectory takes over, and the geometry changes again.
Okay.
After peaking in early adulthood, all three gradient axes slowly begin to contract. That global dispersion metric, the stretching out of the networks, it steadily drops.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. The sharp functional boundaries between the different networks begin to blur. The authors of the paper refer to this process as a global dedifferentiation.
Dedifferentiation, so the strict boundaries collapse. The penthouse default mode executives are suddenly mingling back down in the sensory industrial zones.
Pretty much.
But I have to push back on the framing here. Words like dedifferentiation or contracting sound inherently negative, like the brain is just breaking down. Is this blurring purely a failure of the system, or is the aging brain just finding a more integrated, efficient way to work that doesn't rely on such strict, energy-consuming borders?
That is a highly debated nuance, actually. And the researchers treat it very carefully. They acknowledge that a vast amount of previous literature links this blurring, this loss of strict segregation to cognitive decline.
Right.
Decreased fluid intelligence and slower working memory, they track perfectly with this gradient contraction. The cognitive benefit of having that strictly faithful SA axis just weakens as we age.
But it's not entirely a story of decline, is it?
No, it isn't. The data explicitly acknowledges a shift toward what we call multimodal integration.
Multimodal integration.
Yes. In older age, the brain relies less on strict segregated hierarchies and relies much more on something called global embedding geometry.
Wait, global embedding geometry?
Yeah.
Did we just switch from biology to high-level math again? What does that actually mean for a human being?
I know the terminology is dense, but it simply refers to the overall holistic shape of how all the networks interact together, rather than looking at the strict borders between them.
Oh, like looking at the whole constellation instead of just individual stars.
Exactly. The brain is reconfiguring into a more globally interconnected state. The rigidly guarded hierarchies of youth give way to a more integrated, communicative architecture.
Okay, so to summarize this final concept, a highly stretched, strictly organized brain equals fast, high-performance cognition in your youth. But in older age, those boundaries blur, and the brain relies on the global shape of its connections.
Right.
Think about the older adults in your life right now. How might this biological blurring of boundaries explain why they often possess a more holistic, integrated view of the world, what we might just call wisdom, even if their raw processing speed or short-term memory has slowed down a bit?
It maps beautifully onto the psychological concept of crystallized intelligence, doesn't it?
It really does.
Wisdom requires drawing from a deeply interconnected, less rigidly compartmentalized network.
This has been an absolutely unbelievable journey through the lifespan. Let's do a final synthesis of everything we've uncovered today from Taylor and colleagues' research.
Let's do it.
We are born with a sensory-heavy brain, right? Tightly tethered to our genetic code and our physical hardware.
Yep, the proto-SA architecture.
Right. And then, as children and teenagers, we aggressively stretch our internal map. We migrate our networks and expand our cognitive boundaries to establish executive control. Then, by early adulthood, we have untethered our minds from our genetics to achieve peak cognitive performance.
The software overwriting the hardware.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And finally, we spent our later years slowly blurring those boundaries back together into a highly integrated, holistic whole.
Looking at that entire century-long progression, it really raises a fascinating philosophical question. Yeah. I mean, if our brain's functional map is constantly shifting, expanding, and eventually de-differentiating, and if our actual cognitive software completely decouples from its structural blueprint over time,
Yeah.
does that mean our core self isn't a fixed physical place in the brain at all?
Oh, wow. The self isn't a static piece of hardware. It is a lifelong flowing pattern,
Exactly.
a continuous wave passing through the physical tissue. That's incredible. We invite you to mull that profound thought over during your next quiet moment today.
Thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive.